The summer of 1952 and the heat in the Jordan Valley is punishing. A British archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon stands at the edge of a trench cut deep into the eastern slope of a low, broad mound. A mound that has been accumulating human habitation for so long that it rises above the surrounding plain like an island above a flat sea. Hot, exposed. The air thick with the smell of dry earth and sun-baked mud brick. Around her, the debris of a morning's careful excavation lies exposed in vertical section. Ash, compacted mud brick, pressed earth, ash again, pottery sherds, animal bone, the layered remains of 10,000 years of human life, stacked one generation on top of the last. She is here because another archaeologist, a respected, capable man who worked this same ground 2 decades before her, believed he had found physical proof of one of the most famous events in the Bible. He believed he had found the walls of Jericho, not as a figure of speech. The actual walls. He published a book saying so. Kenyon is here to check his work. What she finds will reshape the conversation for the next 70 years, and has not finished reshaping it yet. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, the story of the excavations at ancient Jericho, what the major digs found, what they concluded, and why the ground beneath that ancient city remains one of archaeology's most consequential and honestly complicated open files. The mound known today as Tell es-Sultan sits at the northern edge of the Dead Sea Plain, fed by a spring called es-Sultan that has been flowing continuously since before any written record. It is one of the lowest permanently inhabited places on Earth, well below sea level, hemmed in by desert, baking under a sun that makes the Jordan Valley feel relentless in summer. And yet people have lived here without substantial interruption for somewhere in the region of 10,000 years, possibly longer. That is not a figure of speech. Jericho is among the oldest continuously occupied settlement sites in the world. The mound that marks its location is not a natural hill. It is a compressed archive of human presence. One civilization building on the rubble of the previous one, generation after generation of life and death and burning and rebuilding pressed down into layers of debris roughly 20 meters deep. Archaeologists call such a mound a tell. Tell es-Sultan is a remarkably deep one. When the first trained investigators arrived at Jericho in the 19th century and looked at that mound, they understood they were standing in front of something significant. What lay inside it had drawn human settlement for millennia, and somewhere in those compressed layers, if the biblical account had any physical dimension at all, might lie traces of one of the most famous events in ancient history. Reading that archive carefully, it turned out, would take the better part of a century, and the reading is still not complete. The first serious archaeological attention Tell es-Sultan received came in 1868, when Charles Warren, an officer of the Palestine Exploration Fund on a broad survey mission across the region, sank a series of exploratory shafts into the mound. Warren was working at the earliest edge of what we might recognize as scientific archaeology. His methods were limited by the standards that came later, and his findings at Jericho were inconclusive. The site was deep. It was old. It had clearly been occupied for a very long time. Beyond that, Warren could not say much. The first systematic excavation came at the start of the 20th century. Between 1907 and 1909, a German expedition led by Ernst Sellen and Karl Watzinger opened trenches across Tel es-Sultan and produced the first serious stratigraphic mapping of the site. Their published report, released in 1913, identified substantial wall systems and described multiple occupation layers. But their analysis of the dating was uncertain and in places contradictory. Watzinger would later revise his own conclusions significantly. The German work had raised the questions more clearly than it answered them. The mound was yielding its secrets slowly. Then came John Garstang. Between 1930 and 1936, Garstang led a sustained British excavation of Tel es-Sultan that would define the popular understanding of Jericho's archaeology for a generation. Garstang was a methodical excavator and a careful recorder by the standards of his era, and what he found in the mound seemed to him to speak clearly. He identified a double wall system, an outer wall and an inner wall, that had collapsed dramatically outward. The outer wall had tumbled away from the city. The inner wall had fallen with it. The entire system showed evidence of fire. And in the destruction debris, Garstang found something that struck him as particularly significant: large ceramic storage jars, still containing carbonized grain. Grain left behind, not consumed by a siege, not looted. A destruction so sudden that the food supply had simply been sealed inside the rubble. He dated that destruction to approximately 1400 BC. The implications were not subtle. Here, Garstang believed, were the walls of Joshua's Jericho. Here was the burned city, the grain abandoned in haste. The outer wall collapsed exactly as a miraculous event might have left it. In his 1940 book, The Story of Jericho, he laid out the case with measured confidence. He had found what people had been looking for. The academic world received his conclusions with cautious interest and cautious skepticism in roughly equal measure. Garstang was not a fringe figure. His work was taken seriously. But the technique of ceramic typology, the dating of occupation layers by careful analysis of the pottery found within them, had continued to develop and sharpen since his campaigns. The question of whether his date of 1400 BC was genuinely secure was one the field had not finished asking. In 1952, Kathleen Kenyon arrived. Kenyon had trained under Sir Mortimer Wheeler and had become one of the foremost stratigraphic archaeologists working anywhere in the world. The method she had helped refine, cutting tightly controlled trenches and reading occupation sequences in the exposed vertical face of the trench wall, layer by layer, rather than clearing horizontally across a broad surface, offered a level of stratigraphic precision that Garstang's excavations had not achieved. She was not at Tel es-Sultan to prove Garstang wrong. She was there to read the site with the best tools available. She worked at Jericho between 1952 and 1958. And what she found, or more precisely, what she did not find, changed the conversation fundamentally. At the center of Kenyon's method was ceramic typology, and here it helps to understand what that actually looks like in practice. In the field, it means picking up a pottery sherd from a destruction layer and reading it the way a specialist reads a document. The curve of the rim, the angle of a handle join, the texture of the clay fabric, whether it was levigated or gritty, fired hard or soft. The profile of a cooking pot or a storage jar changes across centuries in recognizable ways. Shapes that were standard in 1600 BC look different from shapes standard in 1400 BC, and a trained eye can tell them apart with considerable confidence. It is not guesswork. It is a discipline built from decades of stratified excavation across dozens of sites, cross-referencing pottery forms with independently dated contexts. When Kenyon applied that discipline to the destruction layer Garstang had attributed to around 1400 BC, she reached a conclusion that contradicted him directly. The ceramic forms in that layer, the specific profiles of the rims, the characteristic shapes of the vessels, did not belong to the Late Bronze Age. They belonged to the Middle Bronze Age. The destruction Garstang had dated to circa 1400 BC was, in Kenyon's ceramic reading, more accurately placed around 1550 BC. That date is consistent with the Egyptian military campaigns that swept through Canaan at the end of the Hyksos period, a well-documented event in regional history. The walls were real, the collapse was real. The burning and the grain were real. They had simply come down, on Kenyon's evidence, roughly a century and a half before the period the biblical conquest narrative most commonly requires. More significantly, Kenyon found almost nothing from the Late Bronze Age at the site at all. The period spanning roughly 1550 to 1200 BC, the era within which most scholars place the Israelite entry into Canaan, had left virtually no trace on the mound. A single juglet, a small number of scarabs, the thinnest suggestion of occupation, and nothing that looked like city-scale fortification. The large walled city the biblical account describes and the period the biblical account requires was not in Kenyon's findings there. Kenyon published her conclusions methodically through the late 1950s and onward. They became the mainstream scholarly position. They have remained so. But they did not go entirely unchallenged. In 1990, archaeologist Bryant Wood published a detailed reassessment in Biblical Archaeology Review, a popular archaeology magazine aimed at a broad readership, not an academic peer-reviewed journal, arguing that Kenyon had misread the ceramic sequence from the destruction layer. The specific pottery form she had attributed to the Middle Bronze Age, Wood contended, were better dated to the Late Bronze Age, specifically to the 14th century BC. If Wood's ceramic reading were correct, the violent destruction Garstang had excavated would fall within range of the biblical conquest on an early chronology, and the physical evidence would look considerably more consistent with the Joshua account. Walls fallen outward, grain stores intact, the city burned and abandoned. Wood's article engaged seriously with the stratigraphic record and drew on specific ceramic parallels to make its case. It attracted significant attention and has been widely cited in popular literature ever since. Piotr Bayankovsky, a specialist in Bronze Age Levantine ceramics, published a direct response in the same magazine later that year, reasserting the mainstream position and identifying specific weaknesses in Wood's typological comparisons. The broader archaeological and academic community did not accept Wood's revised dating. The consensus did not shift. The mainstream of Syro-Palestinian archaeology has remained firmly with Kenyon's Middle Bronze Age attribution. It is the settled position of the field. not an open contest between two equally weighted camps. Wood's view represents a minority position, sustained largely in confessional archaeology circles rather than in the mainstream academic literature. What the Garstang-Kenyon Wood sequence does illustrate is that ceramic typology involves interpretive judgment as well as technical skill. Two careful scholars can look at the same pottery and date it differently. That does not make all interpretations equally defensible, and in this case, the field has been consistent in its judgment for decades. But it does mean the record of this particular debate is a documented part of the site's history, worth understanding honestly. One factor that scholars acknowledge as a genuine site complication is erosion. The uppermost levels of Tel es-Sultan, the layers that would contain late Bronze Age remains, have been exposed to weathering for a very long time. Mainstream scholars do not treat this as a rebuttal to Kenyon's findings, and they are clear that the scale of a fortified city the size described in Joshua would be expected to leave foundational traces beyond its uppermost layers. But erosion is real. It has affected the site, and it is part of an honest account of what the mound's silences do and do not tell us. More recent excavation work at Tel es-Sultan, including campaigns by Italian and Palestinian teams in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, has continued to refine the site's stratigraphic picture. The broad shape of Kenyon's conclusions has not been overturned. The late Bronze Age occupation at Jericho, in the current state of the evidence, remains thin. What a century of excavation at Tel es-Sultan has produced, taken as a whole, is a picture with several distinct layers. The Middle Bronze Age destruction, the collapsed walls, the burned buildings, the grain sealed in the rubble, is real, vivid, and well documented. The date of that destruction, around 1550 BC, is the settled conclusion of mainstream scholarship, attributed most likely to Egyptian military activity associated with the end of the Hyksos period. It is a dramatic finding. It is also not on the mainstream chronology, the period the conquest narrative describes. The late Bronze Age occupation of Tel es-Sultan, the period within which most scholars place the events of Joshua, has left almost no confirmed material evidence of a fortified city. That is the finding. Not a gap awaiting resolution, but the conclusion of the most rigorous stratigraphic work carried out at the site. Kenyon's conclusion that the large walled city the biblical account describes cannot be confirmed at Jericho for the late Bronze Age is where the mainstream has stood for more than 60 years. The technical challenge to that conclusion, Bryant Wood's ceramic reassessment, exists as a documented minority view. It has not entered the mainstream. It does not represent a live academic contest between equally weighted positions. Erosion has affected the site's upper levels and is acknowledged by all parties as a real complication. It does not, in the mainstream view, account for the absence of fortification evidence at the scale the biblical narrative implies. What the evidence confirms, what it leaves genuinely open, and what has been settled are not the same thing at Jericho, and treating them with precision is the only honest way to handle the site. Jericho is the fault line of biblical archaeology, and it has been for a century. It is the site where the questions become sharpest, where the gap between the written record and the material record is most directly felt, and where the stakes of honest reporting are highest. A century of excavation at Tel es-Sultan produced something more complicated than a confirmation or a refutation. It produced the layered, contested, genuinely difficult reality of a site that holds an extraordinary Middle Bronze Age destruction and an almost empty Late Bronze Age. What the ground contains and what the text describes occupy different strata, and what to make of that gap is a question that belongs to the reader, not the archaeologist. Kathleen Kenyon worked one of the most important sites in the history of Western civilization with extraordinary rigor and reported what she found. The finding has held. That it complicates something does not make it any less the finding. The mound at Tel es-Sultan is still there. The spring at Ain es-Sultan is still flowing. The questions the site raises have not been closed by the spade, and it is worth sitting with why that silence from the right era is so difficult to accept, and what that difficulty reveals about us, not just about the ground. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.